Hey, what's up, guys? Little man with a big opinion here. So, we're gonna get a double dose of videos today because I decided to film my breakfast this morning. So, if you haven't looked at that, it's like an 8-minute watch. I would check that out if you're trying to increase the amount of protein that you're getting. And once this video uploads from my phone and I can mess around with it on my computer, there should be some sort of link to that video in the description, or I'll try to pin it in one of the corners. But let's talk about some news. Um, like I said, this Nancy Guthrie thing is still, it's back to being the number one thing on my list. Like I mentioned the other day, it is, just one of those things where I think it is trying to, uh, bridge the gap, help people out. The thing that I wanted to more talk about was I'm seeing more and more articles and things talking about decline in the United States. And when you take a look at a bunch of different stuff, it looks pretty inevitable. What seems to be keeping a lot of the things afloat is technology and AI. And there's plenty of other categories where we're not seeing much growth of, anything. And then I started reading an article, and it seems like a lot of this decline, probably a good thing, at the top level, but there's going to be some ramifications for, those near the bottom. It's talking about 3M having layoffs, Amazon having layoffs. I saw one thing where 250 Pizza Huts were closing. 90 something percent of these companies that are having layoffs are producing more income. And some of it is technology driven. The vast majority of it is they're cutting bloat out. Stuff that they had 9 people doing. They figured out that 5 people can do the same thing without, overly stressing the 5 out. And so they're cutting 4 people off. And, that sucks. I did appreciate that the article said, jobs that technology isn't gonna mess with anytime soon is more blue collar stuff. Not so much your white collar type jobs. But he also mentioned in this article, which made me want to talk about it, is typically doing stuff yourself has kind of been like a normal bell curve when it comes to age, race, sex, all the different categories. A 1-year-old doesn't do a whole lot for themselves. To reply to this. And a 99-year-old isn't going to do much for themselves. It's more, centered in that 20 to 40-year-old range. But what they're seeing is more and more and more people are really getting into the DIY and doing things, to be more self-sufficient. And as a history teacher, the guy mentions, um, people are uh, just they're doing more for themselves. There's more people focused on cooking foods for themselves. Um, there's a big revival in homesteading and growing your own food, and you know getting more to a simple basic of what you're putting in your body. And the big companies see that too. you know I've seen Lay's and uh, fast food restaurants going to a more simple menu kind of thing. you know the number of ingredients that you're seeing on the back of packages, I think, is slowly decreasing. People are eating more whole foods. They're doing more stuff for themselves. And part of that is things are just more expensive. I did the brakes on my truck. Um, I watched my dad do the brakes on his vehicles growing up. I did the brakes on my car 5 or 6 years ago when it needed them. And I'll admit, I watched a YouTube video that was 5 or 6 minutes long just to make sure I had the basics. And it took me about an hour and a half because I had a 2-year-old that wanted to help me. But we got to spend time outside, got the brakes done. They cost it was about $100 between brakes. I already had some brake cleaner, but getting the grease, and you can technically say it costs more because of the price of the tools. The socket set I'm using was my grandpa's, and I'm slowly accumulating the tools. But I took the truck to the shop because it needed fixing that would have probably taken me most of a Saturday to do. And I do a lot of camping, a lot of stuff with Scouts, so I didn't have, really the time to do that. And I asked him, hey, I just did the front brakes, but I'm curious, what would you charge? And it's a small town local guy that my grandpa has 90% of the work on this truck this guy has done. And he said, yeah, we get it done in about 30, 45 minutes. And parts and labor, a few $100s, which isn't a terrible price. But I would have rather spent $100 in my hour and a half of time than basically double the price, and it be done a little bit faster. Growing more stuff in the garden, cooking more meals from home. My grandma's wonderful. I typically cook dinner 1 or 2 times a week. The wife does it 1 or 2 times a week. Tuesdays and Thursdays, my grandma always does it. There's some times when, my grandma likes lasagna. And if she has a craving for lasagna, even if it's a day that I would normally cook or the wife would normally cook, she's like she'll just send us a message saying, hey, we're having lasagna. Eating meals with the family, the TV goes off, and, we've got the lasagna and corn and green beans, some sort of fruit, tea, that sort of thing. And that's where I think things aren't nearly as bad as we thought they were. Kind of reminds me of the Great Depression. People are, doing more things for themselves. They're saving more. They're being more, financially cautious. And, don't get me wrong. There's people that are, continuing to put stuff on credit cards, trying to figure stuff out. And, that's one of the things that make me feel good about being a prepper. I make it a habit that after I donate plasma, I pick up, I go to Walmart, get more cans of, fruits and vegetables. I've been eating a boatload of tuna, trying to put on more muscle, doing all this working out. And, just looking at the pantry, it's staying fuller, and it's a marathon. It's slowly filling up. The skills, we're learning more skills and developing with the technology. So I kind of think we're somewhat in this plateau period before stuff starts to take off. But we're still figuring it out. In some ways, I think we are kind of in a decline, but it might just look like that from the top down. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comment section down below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends and family. And with that, catch you in the next one.